Hi, I'm Jad. I'm going to be chairing this session. Just to let you know, we're recording the speakers, but we're not going to be publishing any of your contributions. So feel free to contribute. We're going to start. Basically, the two speakers are going to speak, and then we're going to have some time for contribution, and then some time for the speaker to come back. We're running late. We're going to try to finish at 1:45. So we're going to see how we can manage time on that one. Anyway, so this session is titled Neoliberalism, the Workers' Movement and the Struggle for Social Justice. Speakers are Anne Alexander and Mohamed Boutayeb. Anne is the founder of the MENA Solidarity and Egypt Solidarity Initiative, and the co-author with Mustafa Bassiouni of Bread, Freedom and Social Justice, Workers and the Egyptian Revolution. And Mohamed is a Moroccan civil servant and a trade unionist. He is a former leading student activist and political prisoner, and a member of the revolutionary socialist group Al-Munadila in Morocco. He was jailed by the Moroccan regime between 2004 and 2007 for his activism on campus. He currently lives in Rabat. He is an official representative of the Democratic Current in Morocco and a member of the main union council of the Union Marocaine du Travail, which is UMT. Right, so I'm going to start with Anne.
Thanks. And I just want to say it's a great pleasure to welcome Mohamed to the event and to the UK, because it's very rare that we actually get to hear firsthand from comrades in Morocco about the struggles that are going on there. And so I'm very pleased that we've been able to do that. I want to talk in general about the question of how the social struggles that are part and parcel of the revolutionary process that we saw unfolding at its highest level in 2011 to 2012 interact with the political the struggles for political freedoms, and in particular the special, unique role that I would argue that organised workers have played in that revolutionary process, but also some of the limitations of those struggles, and why it is that the demands for social justice, which were such an important part of the revolutions, have not been met, and how that also is going to shape the period that we're in at the moment. How the struggle around social justice demands, the struggle against neoliberalism, is also an enormous factor in the instability of the regimes that have emerged, victorious regimes that have emerged out of the counter-revolution. And that actually it's by looking towards the role of organised workers, and in particular linking up the potential power that organised workers have at the heart of the revolutionary process with the political demands for freedom and democracy, that I think shows the most fruitful path where future revolutionary movements could develop. So to begin with, I think it's worth just emphasising the importance of the social aspects of the revolutionary struggles. That across the region, in fact, in the years preceding 2011, you saw an enormous rise in the scale and intensity and duration of strike action, of sit-ins, of protests by workers, often were organised around the workplace, but also part of a wider picture of social struggles in a more general sense, people revolting against rising prices, organising around issues related to privatisation and delivery of services, and so on. And that the mainstream image that was projected of the revolutions tended, certainly in the media in this country and perhaps in America or in Europe more generally, to focus on youth activists in the streets with mobile phones, using social media and so on. On the ground, I think in many of these countries the picture looked very different, or at least specifically in, I think, two countries, in Tunisia and Egypt. You had the revolutions of 2011 were preceded by years of very intense workers' struggles, including enormous steps forward in terms of for the first time in the Egyptian case, organising independent trade unions for the first time, in fact, in 50 years. This is enormously important because in the years that followed, you also saw then an even higher level of social struggles. The number of protests in Egypt by workers, by organised workers, literally spiralled into thousands taking place. At some point, I think there was about 2 protests taking place every hour, and it's extraordinarily important at this stage, when the counter-revolution has become so fierce and so deep, to emphasise actually how deep some of those struggles went into undoing the normal relations of in the workplace, so that at least in some cases in the public sector, for example in Egypt after Mubarak fell, you had very far-reaching struggles for control over those workplaces, much beyond simply securing the right to organise trade unions and so on, but actually stretching into areas of starting to assert embryonic forms of workers' control over, for example, the delivery of services in the public sector through those new forms of workers' organisation. And I think in order to understand why this is the case, you have to look at the contradictions of the neoliberal reforms that preceded the revolutions of 2011, which again is a very long-running process, going back 40 years of shift in an uneven way across the region from a model of economic development that saw the state as a key to kickstarting industry, to intervening in world markets, the kind of Nasserist or Ba'athist state capitalist model of organising the economy. Since the mid-1970s, on a global scale, economies have moved away from that model, that there's been a consensus at the kind of top levels of the ruling class on a world scale that new forms of capitalist organisation had to take their place, which would not reduce the role of the state, but organise its relationships with private capital in a new way. So, for example, by privatising publicly owned industries, by reducing the role of the state in delivering services. The state is still there as a coercive force, organising and repressing any attempts to stop this process. Organising opportunities for investment, working with sections of private capital, and so on and so forth. But playing a very different role when it comes to delivery of services and goods for ordinary people, and reneging on the kind of implicit social contract that was there in the 1950s and 1960s. A kind of social contract that said, we will give you bread, but no freedom. We will give you subsidised housing. We will give you low-paid jobs, but there will be jobs. We will give you access to all sorts of public services. There will be a kind of minimum guarantee of a slightly more just and equal society, which meant, in fact, genuine, real advances for many people, access to education, to healthcare, and so on. But in return for this, you must keep quiet. You have one leader, we have one party, we have one national cause where we must all participate together. And one of the contradictions, I think, that leads to the explosion of revolution in 2011 is actually the contradiction that emerges between the growing sense of people's anger at this social contract being violated, of the state having said, we will not give you this bread, we will take away the services that we used to give you, we will give you the we will no longer provide housing or healthcare. We will privatise your job and move you from the public sector, where you had at least some kind of rights and job security, by hundreds of thousands, for example, in the Egyptian case, moved in this way to the private sector. We will throw hundreds of thousands of people on the dole, and we will not open up the political sphere for you. You will not have the right to form independent trade unions. You will still have to put up with the same corrupt ruling apparatus of power as you always have done. You know, again, this underscores the lie that was peddled by people in the World Bank, by the IMF, that neoliberal reforms would bring with them some kind of democracy. Actually, authoritarian political systems were necessary a necessary condition of enforcing those neoliberal reforms on the populations of the region. I mention this because I think it's incredibly important to understand that this contradiction still exists, despite the victory of the counter-revolution. In fact, the victory of the counter-revolution in Egypt is precisely about reinstating that kind of system, a very, very brutal authoritarian regime, massive attempts to crush any kinds of political dissent, and particularly to come down very hard on organised workers. So although there's been obviously a huge a wave of repression directed at the political opponents of the Sisi regime, there have also been quite a large number of attacks on workers organising, people facing military tribunals for going on strike, organisers being beaten up on picket lines. It hasn't actually stopped protests taking place entirely. There has been a huge collapse in the number of protests relative to the scale of the strike wave that took place in 2011, 2012. But there are still strikes going on, still people organising on a workplace level. However, as I said before, there are also contradictions, if you like, on our side, on the side of people who are organising to put those demands of social justice in the heart of the revolutions. One of the contradictions I think that's been most apparent, particularly in the Egyptian case, is the way in which the military regime was able to co-opt and integrate some of the key leaders of the workers' movement into the post-Morsi government. So, for example, Kemal Boutayeb, who emerged as a very key figure in the independent workers' movement, one of the founders of the Tax Collectors Union, which was the first independent union, and so somebody who I know personally. I've spoken on platforms with him. He joined the government that Sisi put into place to cement the counter-revolution in July 2013, and went round and toured the TV stations saying, we are going to meet the social demands of the government. I would totally agree with the perspective that Senah Naguib put in the previous session, that the social content of the regime that's in power in Egypt now has nothing to do with Nasserism. It is a neoliberal regime, but it's important to note that rhetoric around the nostalgia for a return to the Nasserist era, the idea of that the state would somehow retreat from its position around neoliberalism, is very important to understanding how there could be a level of popular support among some people for the counter-revolution. Actually, that level of support has been very much, I think, eaten away by the experience that workers had after the Sisi came to power, where there was promised, Kemal Boutayeb's promises turned out to be completely meaningless. They promised, for example, to bring in the national minimum wage, and it was only brought in for a very small number of people, triggering a very large strike wave in January, February last year, which led to the collapse of the Mahlab government. The problem is that the government that came in afterwards was even more neoliberal and even more repressive than the one which fell, which shows the level of contradictions. Just to finish, I think, the key lesson I would argue about the experience of the role of organised workers in the revolutionary process that we've been living through is that actually the demands of the revolution of bread and freedom and social justice express the unity between political and social demands, that it was actually the organised workers' strikes played a decisive role in the fall of Ben Ali in Tunisia and the fall of Mubarak in Egypt. Without their intervention, I don't believe that the revolutions would have even got to that stage. So what we're looking at really, I think, for the future is to understand that those contradictions still exist, that neoliberalism is intensifying the pressure on ordinary people. But what it is that needs to be overcome is this separation between the kind of political opposition to the regimes, which has been, in the Egyptian case, quite successfully divided from the demands of the workers' movement. And to overcome that again actually puts a very important and, I think, crucial weapon in the hands of those who want to see real and genuine revolutionary change in future.
Thank you. Right, so Hamad is going to speak in Arabic, but there will be translation. Right.
صباح الخير. يعني أعتذر إنجليزيتي ضعيفة جدا، وإحنا في المغرب اللغة الثانية هي الفرنسية بحكم الروابط الاستعمارية مع فرنسا، لذلك أنا مضطر لأتكلم عربي. أنا محمد بوطيب، أنتمي إلى منظمة نقابية مغربية، هي أول منظمة نقابية تأسست بعد الاستعمار الفرنسي بالضبط سنة 55، وإحنا يعني تيار في هذه النقابة، تيار في هذه النقابة.
Mohamed is just saying that I'll be translating for him because the second language in Morocco, as you know, is French, thanks to colonial links with France. And he's a member of the... he is a member of the first trade union organization in Morocco, and of one of the currents in this trade union organization, and the organization was established in 1955 after the French colonialism.
وسأتكلم في 3 نقاط بشكل مختصر. أولا هو تأثير السياسات النيوليبرالية على الطبقة العاملة المغربية، والنقطة الثانية الوضع الملموس للحركة العمالية المغربية من حيث طبيعة التنظيم النقابي والخبرة النضالية في السنوات الأخيرة. والنقطة الثالثة تأثير الثورات العربية، وفي المغرب حركة 20 فبراير كحركة سياسية انطلقت بتأثير بالأوضاع الداخلية للمغاربة، وبتأثير من الثورة التونسية والمصرية. ثم أختم بالتدخل السياسي والاجتماعي للنظام من أجل تلطيف الأجواء ومن أجل يعني الحد من تأثيرات النضالات الجماهيرية.
So you'll be speaking about 3 points. The first point will talk about the effect of neoliberal principles on the workers' movement in Morocco. The second point will address the current situation of the workers' movement in Morocco, the experience that they've gained in the past years, and the ongoing struggle. And the third point will address specifically the experiences gained since the And the third point will address specifically the experiences gained since the 2011 uprising, the effects of of workers' movements around the world and specifically in Tunisia.
أوكي. وحتى أتحدث عن تأثير السياسات النيوليبرالية عن الحركة العمالية، أود أن أؤكد بأن في المغرب نعيش نحن في نظام رأسمالية تابعة لفرنسا بالأساس وللدوائر المالية الدولية، البنك العالمي وصندوق النقد الدولي، وفرنسا هي الأطراف الاستراتيجية التي تحدد كل التوجهات الاقتصادية في المغرب. هذا النظام الاقتصادي الرأسمالي التابع يستند إلى نظام حكم مطلق هو استبدادي، يعني مش ديكتاتوري بشكل سافر كما كان الحال مثلا في نظام بينوشي في شيلي أو غيره، ولكن نظام حكم مطلق يجمع أحيانا ما بين القمع المباشر وما بين نوع من الانفتاح الديمقراطي أو نوع من الديمقراطية الشكلية، انتخابات برلمانية وانتخابات بلدية، ولكن غير مؤثرة على الإطلاق.
So the economic system in Morocco is one that is a capitalist system, that is linked very closely to France, and the policies which are directed mainly by its links to France and the IMF and the World Bank. And this props up a totalitarian regime that's not completely dictatorial, that has certain semblances of democracy, such as elections and so on.
والتوجهات الاقتصادية لهذا الاقتصاد الهش والتبعي والمتخلف تقوم بالأساس على سياسات التقويم الهيكلي المفروضة من لا بنك مونديال وصندوق النقد الدولي، وعلى سياسات خوصصة كل القطاعات الحيوية الاستراتيجية، وخوصصة كذلك قطاعات اجتماعية مثل الصحة والتعليم والسكن. يقوم كذلك على اتفاقيات تبادل حر مع نحن في المغرب لدينا حوالي 54 اتفاقية دولية مع الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، وكل هذه الاتفاقيات 54 اتفاقية دولية تسبب في عجز تجاري فظيع جدا بالنسبة للمغرب، وتضر بالاقتصاد المغربي. هناك كذلك اتفاقية الشراكة مع الاتحاد الأوروبي، بموجب هذه الشراكة يعني الخيرات والثروات المادية خاصة الثروات البحرية يعني تباع بأثمان بخسة للاتحاد الأوروبي. هناك
these policies have been it's a very weak economic system that's been very detrimental, and that is, as I said, directed by the IMF and the World Bank, focusing on privatization of public services such as health and housing and education, and has been has led to a devaluation of resources such as marine resources and so on.
هذه التوجهات الاقتصادية يعني هذه التوجهات الاقتصادية تخلق تأثيراتها على الحركة العمالية المغربية. هناك أولا إعفاءات ضريبية للبرجوازية المستثمرة في القطاع الصناعي والمستثمرة في القطاع الفلاحي، لا يؤدون أي درهم على الإطلاق. تأثيراتها أن فرض العقود العمل محددة المدة وتعميم الهشاشة بشكل تقريبا شبه شامل في القطاعات الحيوية للاقتصاد، وسأعطي بعض الأرقام. هناك كذلك عدم احترام الحد الأدنى للأجور المحدد في المغرب في تقريبا 220 أورو تقريبا. هناك كذلك حالة التسريحات الجماعية للعمال في قطاع الفلاحة لوحده. السنة الماضية 30,000 عامل تم تسريحهم في قطاع الفلاحة. 10 سنوات الأخيرة تم تسريح 180,000 عامل، إلغاء 180,000 وظيفة في القطاع الحكومي.
These policies, neoliberal policies, have had a large effect on the Moroccan labour movement. So, for example, there is no respect for the minimum wage in Morocco. There have been tax breaks for basically capitalist corporations, but no tax benefits for example, the agricultural sector. There have been redundancies, about 180,000 jobs lost in the in the public sector, and
من التأثيرات كذلك الخطيرة للسياسات وللتوجهات النيوليبرالية للدولة المغربية هو ارتفاع حجم البطالة. النسبة التي تقدمها يعني المؤسسات الرسمية هي 10% كمعدل، بقرابة تقريبا 1,167,000 عاطل عن العمل. الفصل الأخير من السنة الماضية يعني 3 أشهر من السنة الماضية انضاف إلى البطالة أكثر من 86,000 عاطل عن العمل. هناك كذلك وضعية بالنسبة لنوعية الشغل، لا كاليتي دو ترافاي. 62% من الأجراء يشتغلون بدون عقود عمل.
So one of the other effects of these policies has been a massive unemployment problem. So the official figure is 10%, but in the last 3 months of last year, an additional 86,000 people were added to the number of unemployed, and in addition to that, 62% of those currently employed in Morocco work without contracts, and so are in a very precarious position.
92% منهم في قطاع الفلاحة. في قطاع الفلاحة لوحده 1,137,000 يشتغلون في عمل مؤقت، يعني ممكن يشتغلون 2 أو 3، نتاج التوجهات النيوليبرالية للقطاع الفلاحي في المغرب. الفلاحة المغربية مرتبطة بالاتحاد الأوروبي بشراكات نسميها نحن شراكة استعمارية، يعني كل الفلاحة في المغرب موجهة نحو التصدير لأوروبا، إنتاج الطماطم وإنتاج الحوامض، يعني في إطار التقسيم الدولي للعمل. المغرب الفلاحة المغربية غير موجهة لتلبية الحاجيات الأساسية للمغاربة. نحن نستورد أكثر من 80% من القمح ومن السكر ومن الشمندر، وفلاحتنا موجهة نحو تلبية حاجيات السوق الأوروبية، وهذا ينعكس على وضع العمال الزراعيين.
This number is even greater in the agricultural sector, where 92% of those working in the sector are without contracts and work only a few months of the year. And the agricultural sector in Morocco in general is completely geared towards the EU and in a sort of a neo-colonialist relationship where all of the agriculture is for export to the EU, including citrus and tomatoes, and in the meantime Morocco is left importing over 80% of its essential foodstuffs, and so cannot meet its own needs because all of its agriculture is geared towards the EU.
العمال المغاربة يشتغلون في ظروف سيئة جدا، بحيث أن 80% من العمال لا يتوفرون على أي تغطية صحية، 80% لا يتوفرون على أي تغطية صحية، و75% من مجموع القوى العمالية المغربية تقدر بحوالي 5 مليون لا يتوفرون على ضمان اجتماعي، 75% لا يتوفرون على ضمان اجتماعي، و80% لا يتوفرون على تغطية صحية. وهذا يؤدي إلى طبعا إلى حركة سنتحدث فيما بعد عن وضع الحركة النقابية وعن النضالات العمالية.
In general, workers in Morocco face a very tough situation. 80% of them have no health care, and 75%, a number around 5 million people, have no social security as well. And all of these factors and the circumstances faced by them have fed into the labour movement in Morocco.
بالإضافة إلى ظروف صعوبة الشروط الاجتماعية والاقتصادية، هناك هجوم سياسي قمعي من طرف الدولة على الحرية النقابية. بموجب القانون الجنائي المغربي الإضراب يتم تجريم الإضراب، وهناك تضييق على العمل النقابي في القطاع الخاص. بمجرد ما يتأسس مكتب نقابي في مقاولة ما يتم طرد المكتب النقابي، هذا في القطاع الخاص. وفي القطاع الحكومي يتم التضييق على الحرية النقابية بالاقتطاع من أجور المضربين.
So the trade unions in Morocco face extreme political oppression. Strikes are illegal, and any movement on the part of trade unions can be sort of oppressed and punished in the private sector by a dismissal of the trade union, and in the public sector by a pay cuts for the workers.
حتى أن البرجوازية الزراعية في ماي 2009 في عيد العمال نظمت البرجوازية الزراعية مظاهرات لمطالبة الحكومة بالتدخل لوقف النضالات العمالية.
To the point where in 2009 on May Day, the agricultural union held large protests asking the government to intervene and to stop the protests on the part of the trade union because they were being adversely affected.
النقطة الثانية هي النضالات العمالية، يعني التنظيم النقابي والخبرة النضالية. في المغرب لدينا أكثر من 30 نقابة. كاين هناك 5 نقابات كبرى تتفاوض مع الحكومة، يعني تحظى بصفة النقابة الأكثر تمثيلية، وهناك 25 نقابة صغيرة. يعني لدينا بلقنة نقابية. لا نعيش في المغرب وحدة نقابية، أي طبقة عمالية واحدة، نقابة واحدة، ولكن نعيش يعني طبقة عمالية واحدة وتعدد نقابي، مما يصعب يعقد من شروط نضال الطبقة العاملة.
The trade union struggle in Morocco is complicated by the fact that it's not one sort of trade union and one workers' union, but there are 5 main trade unions that negotiate with the government, and then 25 smaller unions that operate independently. So it's not necessarily one coherent movement basically.
عوامل القمع والنفوذ الليبرالي والنفوذ البرجوازي في الحركة العمالية وغياب حزب عمالي اشتراكي أدى إلى ضعف نسبة التنقيب في المغرب. عدد المنتمون للنقابات لا يتجاوز 6% من مجموع القوى العمالية المقدرة ب5 ملايين.
So the lack of a workers' party or a coherent labour movement, and also the adverse effects of neoliberal policies, and have meant that the membership of trade unions is quite low and is about 6% in Morocco.
التوجه السياسي للقيادات النقابية نسجل عليه غياب سياسة نقابية مستقلة عن البرنامج النيوليبرالي ومستقلة عن الباترونة ودولتها، بمعنى أن القيادات النقابية مندمجة في مؤسسات الدولة وممثلة في كل مؤسسات الدولة في مجلس النواب وفي هيئات أخرى إلى غير ذلك، وتحظى بامتيازات كبرى. يعني نجد أن فرق ما بين شخص عادي منخرط في النقابة وما بين القيادي يصل إلى أكثر من 100% على مستوى الأجر. يعني القيادي النقابي أجرته تصل حتى 12,000 أورو مقابل 200 أورو أو 170 أورو، هذا كحد أدنى لا يحترم. يعني القيادات النقابية ليست لديها أي علاقة على الإطلاق مع القواعد، مما يجعلها تنهج يعني سياسة غير مزكية ومدعمة للتوجهات النيوليبرالية.
Another complicating factor is that the leaderships of the trade unions have been to a great extent co-opted by the government, and so are often in support of the neoliberal policies of the government, and their circumstances are very different from the average worker who is a member of the trade unions, with the difference in salaries sometimes a factor of 10, so that somebody in the leadership can be making 12,000 euros or the equivalent, whereas a regular worker does not even make the minimum wage of 220 euros. So they're very far removed from the realities of the workers.
لكن وجود شبكات من المناهضين للنيوليبرالية وضعيفة من ناحية الكمية ولكن قوية من حيث التأثير النوعي. وجود شبكات في النقابات للمناهضين النيوليبرالية يدفع بالضغط على القيادات النقابية من أجل خوض نضالات. في المغرب في السنة الماضية في أكتوبر كان هناك إضراب عام شارك فيه تقريبا مليون شخص. في القطاع الحكومي بلغت المشاركة 500,000، ولكن المشاركة في القطاع الخاص يعني النقابات في القطاع الخاص كانت ضعيفة جدا، لأن بحكم شروط الهشاشة وعقود العمل محددة المدة إلى غير ذلك. هذه النضالات برزت بالأساس ضد برامج نيوليبرالية في التقاعد بالأساس. هناك إصلاح يرمي إلى التخفيض من أجور الأجراء، يرمي كذلك إلى الزيادة في سن العمل، وهذا مرفوض من طرف الطبقة العاملة، ووقعت ديناميات نضالية ضغطت على القيادات النقابية من أجل إعلان الإضراب العام.
Despite the split between the leaderships of the trade unionists, pressures from the workers led to, in October, a general strike being organised against many of the neoliberal policies which looked to lower wages and extend the age of the working age. Despite the strong networks between the government and those making neoliberal policies and the leaderships of the trade unions, the opposition from the workers to these policies put pressure on the leadership to organise the general strike in October, but the representation of workers in the strike was much greater from the public sector, because workers in the private sector without contracts and face exactly. So the representation was much higher from the public sector.
ومنذ انطلاق موجة النضالات السياسية منذ 4 سنوات بتأثير من الثورات العربية، حققت الطبقة العاملة عدة مكاسب. أود أن أنبه إلى مسألة أساسية. انطلقت موجة النضال السياسي من أجل الديمقراطية والعدالة الاجتماعية في المغرب في 20 فبراير. أسبوع فيما بعد أرسل الملك مستشار له للقاء القيادات النقابية. أول إجراء سياسي قامت به الملكية في المغرب هي المفاوضة مع النقابات من أجل تحييدها من الصراع، وقد كان لها ذلك. يعني بموجب هذا اللقاء السياسي بين الملكية بحضور مستشار الملك وما بين 5 منظمات نقابية كبرى، عملت القيادات على تحييد الطبقة العاملة من النضال السياسي مقابل تنازلات مادية كان هناك اتفاق نقابي تنازلت فيه الدولة بحوالي 1.3 مليار أورو لصالح الحركة النقابية، وهو مبلغ ضخم جدا مقارنة مع الناتج الداخلي الخام المغربي. كانت هناك كذلك تنازلات لصالح الزيادات في أجور المهندسين وشغيلة المحاكم والمعلمين والصحة والفوسفاتيين وعمال سكك الحديد. يعني قدمت الدولة تنازلات اجتماعية كبرى مقابل ضمان عدم مشاركة الطبقة العاملة في النضال السياسي. ساعدها في ذلك البيروقراطيات النقابية وغياب مناضلين عماليين في النقابات، مما جعل حركة 20 فبراير هي الحركة السياسية التي كانت تعمل على إسقاط النظام السياسي، معزولة من تأثير العمال، وتقوم بمظاهرات في يوم الأحد، مظاهرات كل شهر في يوم الأحد بدون مشاركة العمال. سهل هذا على الدولة احتواء الحركة فيما بعد.
So this can be seen as a sort of somewhat of a success on the part of the workers' movement, but it also sort of ended up backfiring for the political uprising in Morocco as a whole. Is that when the wave of democratic protests began on the 20th of February, one of the first political moves taken by the government was to send representatives to talk with the leadership of the trade unions in order to get them on their side, basically. And so in exchange for their refusal to participate in these protests, they received certain gains, certain material gains, such as the raising the minimum wage for certain sectors, engineers, railway workers, and so on, and also basically benefits that amounted to 1.3 million euros, which is huge in relation to the Moroccan incomes, basically. And so that held back the trade unions from taking part in these protests for political change, and they were co-opted basically successfully by the government.
والخلاصة التي خرجنا بها، يعني نحن المناضلين النقابيين ذوي الأفكار الاشتراكية الثورية، هي أن أي حركة سياسية في المغرب للمطالبة بالديمقراطية والعدالة الاجتماعية ستصطدم بقوة وجبروت النظام في غياب مشاركة عمالية موسعة. وبالتالي الخيار الأساسي هو العمل من أجل تقوية الديمقراطية الداخلية في النقابات، ومن أجل تقوية التنظيم الذاتي للعمال، والعمل كذلك على بناء أحزاب عمالية راديكالية ضد النيوليبرالية. دون هذا الخيار أي حركة سياسية تستند على الطبقة الوسطى وتستند على الشباب إلى غير ذلك ستصطدم بالنظام الرأسمالي. وهذا كان درس هام جدا، لأن حركة 20 فبراير كانت حركة سياسية راديكالية ولكن غير مدعمة بحركة إضرابية. هناك مليون شخص في الشوارع ولكن المعامل تشتغل ومؤسسات الإنتاج تشتغل، وليس هناك إضرار بالمصالح الاقتصادية للنيوليبرالية. كان هذا درس هام جدا للمناضلين العماليين.
One of the greatest lessons basically taken away from this experience by the activists was that any movement that remains separated from the workers' movement, any political activist movement, even though it was very radical, is basically doomed to come up against the oppression of the state and to failure without a strong representation and cohesion with the workers' movement. And also, so hopefully there will be one of the ways where this can succeed is with the establishment of workers' parties and more democratic practices within the trade unions themselves, and only basically with this strong connection between the labour movement and the political activists can they succeed. And this was the biggest lesson taken from the experience of the last few years.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.